Kia ora, welcome to Bus Days. So I've got another little haul from AliExpress. This time it is a exhaust and intake kit for the diesel heater that I bought previously. I bought that in New Zealand at an auction, and it had no exhaust and intake in it, so I've gone out and bought some. Very cheap, of course, AliExpress being what it is. I'll put a link down in the description if you want to buy it. So first up is an air intake, which I understand is a filter and essentially muffler to quieten down the air intake, and a bit of air intake tube and some fittings to go with that. And the exhaust, which is a stainless steel exhaust pipe and a stainless steel muffler and mounting kit. Now, something I have noticed is it's a straight through muffler with just a spring in there, so I guess all it's going to do is really take the harshness off the noise. So it'll be interesting to see how well that quietens it down. I mean, that in New Zealand, that alone's about 40 bucks. So there's that, and then there's some ducting for the heater itself, and a outlet, angled outlet, which could come in handy. I actually already have an outlet. Now, I also bought separately this exhaust wrap, which will insulate the exhaust. I guess on the one hand it'll keep the exhaust warmer in a cold, it just fits over like that. So when it's cold it'll keep the exhaust warmer and maybe reduce the risk of condensation, but more importantly perhaps it will stop the exhaust from burning anything nearby. So that's all of that in a handy bag from AliExpress. I can't recall how much it was around about $30 or something like that. It's pretty bloody cheap. So now I think I'm ready to do a test run up of this diesel heater. So here's the heater upside down. It's going to mount onto this mounting plate here, pretty much in that position. So it has an intake and an exhaust here. Obviously the exhaust is quite hot, the intake is actually plastic. Now, an interesting thing about it is it has a wire coming out the intake. Now that is for the fuel pump, so that will just tuck down through that gap there, and then that'll be covered over with the intake hose, pretty much like that. So that should all go fine. This little pipe here is actually the fuel intake. I'll leave a protective cap on for now. So what I've got to do is mount this plate on here, and I'll do that now. First is this little rubber gasket. Now, because this bit here is essentially outside the vehicle, the gasket seals so once I've cut a hole in the floor to mount this, the hole will be here, and this will essentially be outside the vehicle, whilst the rest of the heater's inside the vehicle. So the rubber gasket, which you may be able to see, the rubber gasket in here seals the inside of the vehicle from the outside of the vehicle. Quite important, of course, because you've got exhaust gases. So this can now tuck down the side there, and we'll just do that up. So that's the heater mounted onto the floor plate, and I'm going to essentially mount it like that onto my simulated vehicle, also known as half a beer crate. So with this intake, I'm just going to bend the edge around so that it's not sharp against the cable that comes out the side of the air intake, and tighten this up. Now just like the exhaust, that will actually need to be sealed, but where the exhaust is going to be very hot, this shouldn't be, so we'll only need maybe a silicone or something similar. Now the last connection underneath the heater will be the fuel line. That has come in the kit, so I've got these, which are slightly nicer looking fittings, but again, this is fuel, so I may upgrade them, and some little bits of rubber hose. Now the rubber hose enables me to jam the nylon fuel line into it, so that makes it easy to connect it to other things like the fuel pump and the heater itself. So this just literally squashes into there and can be tightened up with the clamp. But first I have to remove protective thing and put the rubber hose to the bottom of the heater and just tighten that up. Right, so that's all the connections underneath the heater, so that I should now be able to mount it on my test frame. So since this is only for a test run, this should do fine. Everything fits through the gap, nothing is touching any of the wood, and I'm actually just going to run some screws down the side of this plate on each corner to simply to hold it there temporarily. I don't want to put any holes into the plate just yet for a more permanent mounting, because I don't know exactly where I want them. So there we go. All I've done is just put a couple of screws on each corner just outside the plate to essentially clamp it down. Interestingly, in the New Zealand kit, whilst I don't actually have any exhaust pipe, I do have quite a nice exhaust clamp, which I think I'll use on the final build, and a much heavier, stronger looking clamp which I can use on the air intake. That also gives me quite a lot more confidence in the fuel line clamps. The muffler doesn't have any indication of flow, and since the spring is attached at both ends, I guess it doesn't matter. So I've hooked up the muffler. I've actually mounted this exhaust just so that the weight of the muffler is not hanging on the outlet of the heater. The intake weighs next to nothing, it's just plastic, so I'm not so worried about that. After taking off this little access panel, reveals a little bit of info about the heater itself. It says it has an output of 2 kilowatts and it requires 12 volts and it runs on diesel, which we already knew. It's got like a version number and maybe a serial number. At the bottom here, if we can see, is a multi-pin plug. Now it has a cable exit point on both sides so that you can run the power or the control cables out either side for convenience. Now the wiring loom itself looks reasonably good actually. It's got rubber seals on the plugs, and this plug has got a nice long handle. Because it's quite deep in there, it appears to have a spot to put a screwdriver to loosen it, so that should make it able to be removed. It seems reasonably well wrapped, and it has this rubber grommet which will seal off whichever hole it comes out. So the end of the wiring loom is this big plug again with many terminals, although interestingly not all of them are used. I note it has a little notch cut out of it here so you can't accidentally put it on the wrong way around. So it simply drops into this hole. You fiddle around, you can feel it fitting correctly, and then it's quite easy to feel it going all the way in. Now it looks, which just pushes in and locates in there, so that actually will lock it in place so that it won't wiggle its way out. For today I'm going to run the cable across the top and out the far side. There's a nice little gap in here to run the cable through and a little clip just to hold it down to support it, and then the grommet fits in nicely at the other end. So when I put the cover back on, this side will be closed by the fact that there's no hole on this side, and this side will slide into a slot especially made for it in the grommet. So that's that bit done. Now as I follow the wiring loom along, there's quite a nice little fuse. Again, a nice little rubber seal on it, and it's fitted with a 20 amp fuse, and nice little catch with a lock and a mounting tab so they can go somewhere convenient. There's also a little tag here explaining that it requires a 20 amp fuse if it's 12 volt or a 15 if it's 24. Now I guess that my red and brown are positive and negative. Red will be positive. It's not really a guess, because if I look at this, it's a positive that should be fused, and the red wire has got the fuse on it. The brown wire goes straight to the heater, so that means that the red wire is going to need to be connected to my positive power supply and the brown wire to the negative. Now that's going to require a 20 amp input, so I don't really want to have wires that are too long. I mean, this is already quite long as it is, so this end really needs to be connected to a significant power supply. Now the other part of the wiring loom is this bit, which I'm guessing must be for the control circuitry. And what do you know, the little LCD controller has two matching plugs in matching colours, that can go into these two. Nice and easy to put together. I mean, you know, the black plugs into the black, the white plugs into the white. No difficulty there. In terms of plug orientation, you can't really get that wrong either. It's got a latch on this end of the plug and a matching hook on this end of the plug, and the plugs themselves, the holes are a different shape. So there's some that have got rounded edges and some that are square. So it can really only go one way. Like that. Right, so now all we need is a power supply. Oh, and some fuel. But I've got a flat battery and it's time I made some dinner. So I'm out of here. Back soon. Okay, so let's catch up from a couple of days ago when I started setting up this heater. The heater's mounted temporarily onto this little box. The exhaust system is hooked up again, just temporarily. Now, in a real situation on a vehicle, the exhaust should terminate vertically downwards. I'm not going to do that here because I don't need to just yet. But I guess it's really to drain any condensation out. I'm not actually sure whether I'm going to terminate it with the muffler or whether it would be in between another piece of exhaust, but at this stage that's how it's going to be. Bit of exhaust coming out of the unit. It will be wrapped in real life with the wrapping that I showed you earlier and a muffler at the end. The air intake side is just hanging here because it weighs nothing. And I've hooked up the wiring. So I've put into here the main plug, and the wiring loom is running down here. It connects using these two coloured plugs to the control unit. So that's all ready to rock. And then you've got a fuse and positive and negative cables ready to hook to a battery. So the other cable coming out of the heater is the fuel line, the fuel pump wiring. That also has quite a long extension, which I probably won't need today, and that goes to the fuel pump. So again, just push-in plugs, can't get them wrong, they can only go in one way. And by that I mean that they've got a small groove about where the tip of my thumbnail is, which lines up on the other end with this little lump there that can't, so you can't put them on back to front. They look like quite nice plugs. They have a rubber seal inside them and quite a nice locking mechanism, so they look quite nice. And this is the actual fuel pump. Now it of course has a flow direction indicated by an arrow here, and it should be pointing slightly uphill, maybe like about 15 to 30 degrees or something like that. So when it's installed, it should be pointing uphill, which is fine. I've got some fuel line, I've got a fuel filter, which again, fuel filters, they also have a flow direction. It's probably written on it, there it is there, if you can see it. It's an arrow pointing upwards. So the blue end being the outlet, and they usually are installed like that, but I really don't think that even matters where that's installed. Bit of fuel line and some connectors that make it all easy, and some clamps. So what I don't really want to cut this up too much, so what I might do is cut minimum length sections to where I need joins and leave one big long section for the remainder. I also have this fuel suction pipe, I guess, that actually goes into a tank. It's actually meant to go right into the tank. I may not really use it, I might just drop a fuel line into the tank for testing. And lastly is this, the fuel pump mount. So the fuel pump literally sits inside that. It's a fairly tight fit, but I guess that's how it goes there. You'll note some of the stuff's got surface rust on it. It's been sitting around, I guess, for a little while before I bought it. Hopefully it still all works fine. So I'm actually going to put the filter immediately before the pump. Only at this stage because I don't want to cut another section of fuel line, so that means I can just cut off one piece to run from the pump up to the actual heater, and the remainder can sit below the filter all in one piece. So I've only cut one little piece off. Now I'm going to cut this with a knife. This is a small, this has a very small hole. I don't know, what is it, maybe a mil or something. So if I cut it with scissors that could crush it, so I'm going to cut it with a knife to make sure that doesn't happen. So I've got the pump in place. I simply pushed these on. I haven't put the clamps on at this stage and won't bother for the test, but of course in normal use you would want to clamp that. You push the hose in as far as you can until it's touching, well, the other hose that's pushed in, so that there isn't a gap of a larger diameter, because this is a significantly larger diameter obviously to fit the hose in it. If the hose only went part way in, then there'd be a piece of hose in the middle here of a larger diameter which could easily trap bubbles. I want to try and keep the bubbles out. So from here it simply comes up, and it should be uphill the whole way from here into the bottom of the heater. Again, so you don't end up with a hoop, a high point where bubbles could collect. I actually will have to take that off to bleed the system to get it started. Beyond here, down to the fuel source, I don't think that matters too much. I think there's probably limits on how much height this can suck from, but none of that's going to really matter in the actual installation, and putting a fuel tank on the floor is probably going to be the hardest work it'll ever have to do. So for a fuel supply, I have simply poked this into a can of diesel. For a power supply, I'm using my camping battery, which is kind of pre-set up, which will be quite handy because I have a voltmeter and ammeter there. So I've connected the battery up here, which means this is now on. Now, I don't know what this stuff means though, so I'm going to fiddle around and try and work out how to get the pump running. Alright, so this is sucking away now. I've managed to find a setting that causes it to suck the fuel up constantly to bleed the fuel system. So you can see right here now it's just sucking all the air bubbles through, and as soon as I get a continuous flow of fuel, which won't at all be helped by my coiled fuel line here, but as soon as I get a flow of fuel instead of air bubbles, we'll be away. Okay, so I'm getting a reasonably constant flow of fuel through here now. There's still a couple of air bubbles in this line. I can still see a couple down here, but probably good enough to run. And that's the pump shutting off after a 3-minute continuous burst. So I'm going to hook this fuel line up to the heater now and turn it on and see if it works. So I've simply switched it on to manual heat because I still can't work out how the timer works, and you can hear there that the fan's running. It also means that the fan's not kind of stuck in the housing or anything. Now you hear it slowed down. Also the amps have gone up, so it's gone up to around about 9 amps, which I guess means it's actually trying to fire up the glow plug. As yet the pump is not running. Not knowing how it should work, I don't know if that's a problem or if everything's going perfectly to plan. It's just set on 7, which I think is the highest. I can hear the pump running now. Run a few pumps there. The fan speed's coming back up. Amps are still around 9 amps. How would I even know? Oh, a little bit of smoke coming out of the exhaust. That's got to be a good sign. Actually, it's about time I open the garage. Okay, I've opened the garage so that I don't die. And this is working. So the exhaust has stopped smoking. Stopped smoking almost immediately. And sounds a little bit like a very well muffled jet engine. Amps is still up around 9 amps. Air intake speed has come up and I'm getting warm air. This is seriously cool. That was really quite easy. I think having that prime setting on it does make life a lot easier. And we have definitely got nice warm air coming out of here. And hot exhaust coming out of there. Excellent. I'm going to leave that running for a little bit and see how it looks. Okay, so this baby is chucking out hot air. It's actually on a really low setting. It's on 1 of 7 of just constant heat. I haven't set it up on the thermostat or the timer at this stage. I'm just running it on as a heater just to check it all works. The exhaust is actually surprisingly little exhaust. I kind of thought there would be more, but then it is on low. The pump sticks away nicely. I hear a lot of people talking about how noisy they are. I don't know how well that works. I can feel the pump, but it doesn't seem to be transmitting a lot of that vibration through to the box. You can see the fuel line shake as it pumps. You can also see a little bit of leak here because I do not have any fittings on it for the purpose of testing. Now on low it's using about 0.9 of an amp, so maybe 12 watts. About 10 watts. 10. So maybe about 10 watts, and that's on low. Now if I turn it up to the highest setting, what we'll get is the pump will speed up a bit, the fan will speed up a bit, the amps will go up a bit. So now it's cranking. There's a lot of hot air coming out of here. The fan's going at what sounds like full noise. We're up over 2 amps. Interesting, you can actually see the this is not the best ammeter. It's a bit scatty, but you know, a little over 2 amps, so we're pulling sort of maybe about 25 watts, maybe close to 30 watts, which kind of makes sense. So its operating wattage should be about 30 watts at full noise, and probably more like 10 to 15 on low. So very happy, test has gone well. I'm going to shut it down now. I don't know how to do it. Actually, looks like I did. So I simply press the off button. You can hear the burner has stopped. Still pumping out a lot of heat. Interestingly, the amps have gone way up, so maybe it runs the glow plugs on shutdown as part of the process. The fuel pump has stopped. So it's definitely shutting down. The air's cooling down a fair bit. Still quite warm. I guess we will keep running the fan until that's cold. There's still a little bit of heat coming out the exhaust, but it sounds like it's been blown out. There's no longer a fire, if you like, and we're down to 0.8 amps, 0.9 amps. Seriously impressed with this. Very cool. Yep, I think I want that in my bus. And that's the end of that. It's turned off. This is sufficiently cool that it just feels barely warm to touch, which is nice. Likewise of the casing. Obviously cold at that end. Everything's shut down, and it's a successful test. So just to recap, we've tested the Belief 12 volt diesel air heater, and it's awesome. It's just awesome. It's cheap. It's a seriously cheap alternative to the the flash expensive ones from the companies that charge far too much and got caught price fixing and yet still charge far too much. The Chinese clearly know what they're doing when they're copying stuff, and whilst I'm sure there are some pretty crappy ones out there, I've heard some pretty bad horror stories, this one's a beauty. Belief does appear to be one of the more premium Chinese brands. You can buy them here in New Zealand. There's a couple of suppliers. I won't go into the details of them because that's not where I bought mine. And they're under $1,000, so you know, like, it's pretty good value. However, below in the description I have a link to AliExpress where I was going to buy it had I not come across this second-hand one. That'll save a bit of coin buying it through them. The kit's awesome. The exhaust, the muffler, which I was a little bit worried about, is actually very quiet. Very, very quiet. People talk about them being far too loud. I can't see. It sounds a lot more quiet than listening to a Truma gas heater or anything like that. But I don't know, maybe it'd be different installed in the vehicle. The fuel pump seems fairly quiet. The whole thing started up first try, had a great priming setup. built, pre-programmed priming setup, which was really easy to use. The whole thing's just awesome. Obviously I've yet to check that the thermostat does what I was hoping the thermostat would do and things like that. I can't do that in a shed. But very successful test. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, click all the buttons, like and subscribe, and that means with a bit of luck we'll see you again soon. Take care.